This is a cam position sensor on a 1997 Dodge Ram 2500 V10 engine. Go under and you'll find the cam position sensor right there. Okay, so I got very lucky. The electrical connection just came off with using my fingers pressed down on this tab here. You can see that tab moving, and it's pretty brittle, but it didn't break. I'm going to remove this 10mm bolt and then pop this sensor out. I have this bolt out. It's actually an 11mm, not a 10mm. So I got it out. I'm just going to try to wiggle it out by hand. Let's see how well I can do that. So I can feel it's almost out. I just picked it up here so I could turn it some, and then I've just been kind of working it like this. Real easy. Just trying to get it past that O-ring, and then I know it'll come out. So it did come out. Just kept prying on it. Not prying on it, I should say. Just kept kind of rotating it some and rocking it like this, just by hand, not hard, just repetitive. And here she is. Okay, so this is very important to follow these installation instructions for the cam sensor. Whether you're installing it, a new one, or your old one. Like, let's say you were in there, pulled the old one out to do the chain or something like that, you have to reinstall it into the case. The reason it's very important to install these correctly is because if you don't, the cam gear is going to come around and it's going to break this sensor. And here's why it's going to do that. Alright, so I already showed you the position there. This is only applicable for the V10 engine, and the other Rams of this year, they've got a distributor, and the cam sensor's in the distributor. Alright. So, as you can see, there's a mention here of a paper spacer. I'm going to get back to that in a second. This is the, let's see if we can focus, there we go. This is the cam drive gear here, and as you can see, it's got two different diameters. It's got smaller diameter here, larger diameter there. This smaller diameter is a low machine surface. The larger diameter is a high machine surface. The air gap between the end of the tip of the sensor is measured with respect to the high machined area, so the larger diameter. So if you put this in and you happen to have, the engine happens to be in a place when it stopped, the cam gear happens to be in a place when the engine stopped, that you're measuring from the smaller diameter, you're going to lose that cam sensor, because when this thing starts up and spins around, the larger diameter, that corner is going to hit that sensor and shear it right off, and then you're not going to have a sensor anymore that works. So here's the specific numbers that you're looking at, and just as a clue, right? So this sensor, you notice it doesn't have a fully constrained bolt hole here. It's got a path. So this tells you that you're going to be able to move this, like let's say the IKEA symbol is your bolt hole in the case. Well, you're going to be able to move this like that, right? And that's adjusting the air gap, which is the distance between the tip of the sensor and the high machine surface on the cam drive gear. So here's the exact numbers that it's from the manual. Again, okay, so let me say, when you stop the engine, you got about a 50-50 chance that the high machined area is going to happen to be where the sensor is. If the low machined area is where the sensor is, you're going to find out by measuring from the case to the low machined area, and you're going to get this value, that depth. In that case, you need to stop, do not install sensor like it says. Instead, get a socket on the dampener on the crankshaft and turn the engine clockwise, just enough to get this highly machined side facing the hole where you're going to insert the sensor. Now, your other 50-50 chance is that you put a measuring device in there and you get this value, 1.818 inches. And it says here, okay to install the sensor. Now, doesn't mean just push the sensor in, because there's still another step. But this is saying that you don't need to turn the engine any. So how are we going to measure this? Well, if you've got a little ruler that you can stick in there, then try that. But I don't, so I just grabbed a socket, put a piece of tape on it, and I got my calipers set to 1.1. Oops, it just turned off. Let's see if it'll come back on. 1.818 inches, and I measured that real well. Can't really see it too well, but it does line up to that 1.8 mark. Made a mark on with a pen, 1.8. Open this up a bit more to my second value, which is 2.018, and then made another mark here for 2.018. So this is a difference of 200 mil. It's enough to, you can see that's enough of a distance. You're not going to make a mistake in measuring that. Then what I'm going to do is I'm going to take this socket, go back to the truck, and in the hole that I took the cam sensor out, I'm going to stick this in. And if when I stick it in, if it hits the highly machined area, right, so if it hits this higher part, I'm going to get 1.8. 1.8 is going to line up with the casing like that. So the casing is going to be like that. Well, if I can push it in further and I get that 2 mark, then I know that it's on the low machine surface. So that's when I would stop and say, okay, I got to turn the engine. So that's the deal that you need to keep in mind with measuring. You have to measure before you install the cam sensor to get an idea of where the cam drive gear is. Now, the directions now differ between whether if you're installing a new cam sensor or your original. And now the directions say you have this little rib. Alright, can you see that little rib there on the tip? On your new cam sensor, you'll have that same rib. On a new cam sensor, that rib is supposed to be the right height for the air gap. Air gap meaning the distance between the end of the sensor and the highly machined surface. Okay, this is this value here. That's supposed to be the constraint. If you've got a new sensor, it's supposed to have a little rib on there. And so in that case, what you'll be able to do is just make sure that you're on the highly machined surface, put the sensor in, and tack it down. And that little rib that's on the tip, when this comes around, it'll shear off the tip of the rib, but that's it. It's not going to take out a 200 mil chunk of the sensor itself. Okay, so that little plastic rib is disposable. It's supposed to be able to be sheared off. And what I mean here is if you read through these directions, sensor removal, replacing with new sensor. So you're going through all the same steps. You're still making sure that you're in the right area. You're going to turn the engine if you get this higher value. If you get the lower value, you can continue. So now you're just going to install it in. And that, assuming that you have a quality aftermarket sensor, because Dodge doesn't even make these sensors anymore, that little rib should be enough to set your air gap. And then it's light enough and it's far enough up from the sensitive stuff in this sensor that when this comes around, it's just going to grind it off and you're going to be okay. It'll set the air gap. Now if you're installing an old sensor like this one, the steps are a little different. So those steps I'm going to tell you about next. Alright, so I just gave the instructions on how to install a new one. A new one, you're not going to have to use a paper spacer, but on an old one, used one, you will. So you can see on the tip of this, most of that, there we go, most of that rib has been sheared off. So we can't just press this up against the highly machined surface like we can with a new one, because we won't get the right air gap. So what we have to do is shave this off with the razor. Just shave off that part so it's nice and flat. And then we're going to use a paper spacer. Now because I couldn't find it anywhere online, and because I don't have another sensor to measure, and it'd be kind of tough to measure one anyway, I had to buy this paper spacer from Dodge. And this is the part number. 5252229 AB. When you search this online, you're not going to get a match for this cam sensor. But when you look in the parts catalog, you will see a match, because here is the part number for that cam sensor. EWO, that's a reference code for all V10s, meaning that it fits all V10s. And here's your spacer. Same number. And to show you, let's see, I can show you that reference code too if you end up with one of these parts diagrams. Down here, these reference codes. There we go. So EWA is the V8, and then when you have a O at the end, like here, O, ELO, EWO2, or also, that means it's for all applications. So this is the right spacer. And here's this tiny little spacer, which is just a little piece of paper with a sticky pad on the back. That cost me like $8 at the Dodge dealer, but whatever. Now you don't have to use this spacer because I'm giving you the air gap value. And it's 35, what do you got? 35 mil. So use whatever you have that's 35 mil. Use a little shims with some sticky on the back, whatever. And put it, shave down the tip of your old sensor. Put this spacer, or whatever you're using to space, on here. And then that's what we're going to insert in to touch the highly machined surface. And then once we have it in with that paper spacer, we're going to make a mark on the chain case with this as a reference plane, a scribe mark. Okay, so you're going to make a mark. It's actually like that when it's in the engine. We're going to make a mark, pull the sensor out, take the paper spacer off, put the sensor back in, line up our scribe mark, and go ahead and put the bolt in. Another thing too is if it is old like this one, you could basically see where that bolt's supposed to be, right? Because you can see the circle that it made. That's another clue. That should be lining up when you reinstall this, if you're installing the sensor into the same block. Now, however, because these sensors are so hard to come by now, some people buy used ones and they're going into different blocks. Well, the thickness of the casing is why you have to use this spacer in the first place, because there's variability in the thickness of the spacing, so the reference plane is not a good one. That's why they couldn't over constrain it, and they had to use a slot for the bolt. So that's the deal. Back under here, I got my socket. So I'm going to put it in here and see what we got. .8. So the cam drive gear, highly machined surface, is facing the sensor location. So that means it's okay to put the sensor in. But if it wasn't, then I'd be able to get this socket in there quite a bit more. And so I'd have to come over here to the dampener pulley and turn the crank by hand just enough to get, let's see if I can get under here a little bit more, just enough to get the cam gear in the right position. Let's see if that'll focus. So I'll go in it one more time and maybe see a little bit better. So here's my socket with my marks on it. I'm just going to push it in, make sure that I don't drop it, and as you can see, it's right there to the 1.8. You'll be able to hear it hitting the gear. So if it was in more to that 2, then you need to turn the engine. Okay, so I got my little, there we go, I got that little piece of paper on there now, and you can see that that's the air gap. It's very close. So I'm going to go push this in. mark the chain case, mark the scribe line, pull it out, take that off, push it back in, tack it down, and then the torque on that little bolt was, well, the torque on that little bolt was 50 inch-pounds. And hopefully she'll start. Alright, so I'm back under here. There's no way I'm going to be able to see that a mark on this case, so I put this piece of tape here so I can mark this. I got a little oil on the O-ring, got the paper thing at the end. Now, again, if this is your new camshaft sensor and you've already verified that you're at that 1.8 depth and not the 2 point whatever depth, then go ahead and you just, if this is your new sensor, it's got the little rib on it, go ahead and just put it in. If you got a new sensor and it doesn't have a rib on it, then you probably have a bad sensor, or it's probably actually a used sensor, because it's supposed to have a rib. But if that's so that's how you would do it. You just put it in till it taps the cam gear, and then put the bolt in, and you're done. Putting in this old one, this is how you do it. You have to put it in first till it taps, scribe the tape, pull it out, take the plastic thing or the paper thing off, put it back in lined up with the tape. Okay? I don't think I'm going to be able to do this with one hand, because it is a little bit of, you want to kind of rock it, it says too. You don't want to twist it too much. Just want to kind of rock it in. Okay, so there's the sensor. It's in. And you can actually feel, when it's in, you can feel it kind of rubbing up against the cam drive gear. So there's my mark, and I cut it with the razor blade too, but I'm actually going to do a couple more marks. I'm going to do a paint pen here to here, and then I'm going to put tape right here so I know when to stop when it's flush. Okay. So, I couldn't find a paint pen, so I just made a mark there and there. And that's what I mean with the tape. I just pushed the tape right up to the case, and then pressed it onto here. So now I have 4 different ways to check the constraint on this, because there's no way you're getting your head up in this space. It's tiny. You can be using mirrors and cell phones like this. This is another good way. Record it, so when you look at it later you can see. It looks also there like that's lined up really well with that hole. You can see the mark on the bracket from the previous time it was bolted on. So this looks good. I'll take it out, take the paper spacer off. Alright, it's in. My marks are lined up. Looks like it's lined up well there. And the tape looks like it could actually come in just a tiny bit, like that. That'll happen, I guess, when I get the bolt in. And so I'm going to go ahead. Yep, looks good. I'm going to go ahead and put the bolt in and plug in the electrical, and hopefully she'll start. Okay, line up looks good. See how well this lines up with those previous marks. Perfect. Okay. Lined up, lined up, lined up. Okay. So now let's see if she will start. There we go.